the 18th century, and a lot of Austen's novels have this as a background. But there was a new class of people that were also involved. Not the Bingleys, not the Darcys, not the landed gentry, even of Austen's own family, but a different group. Merchants and traders, who do come in many of Austen's novels, and engage in a kind of overseas trade that is especially important because it redefines what we think of as human beings and what makes them valuable. So while England remained an agrarian and an agricultural country throughout the 18th and early 19th century, this trade that happened with Ireland, that happened with the European continent, and that happened increasingly with British colonies, led to a whole new idea of what it meant to be a human being. And it's largely because these individuals became fabulously wealthy. And they became fabulously wealthy in a very different way than Darcy and Bingley did. Darcy and Bingley inherit their money. And they inherit their money from their estate. Inheriting the estate means inheriting the income. For these merchants, it's a different way of making money. It's trading and actually taking capital and going out and risking it and getting the profit. A very different way of making money that we would now think of as nouveau riche. Austen's family was a gentry family. That's significant because 18th and early 19th century England is still an aristocratic society. I just want to give you some sense of what that means. Most people were divided into two classes. You were either noble or you were common. You either had noble blood or you didn't. And the thing that's significant about that designation is you don't get to pick and you don't get to switch. You either have it or you don't. How do you know if you have it? You ask your father. You are dependent, or your position in society is dependent on your birth. Where you're born indicates what you are worth in that culture, and you don't get to change it. That at least was the theory. It's a lot more complicated than that in practice, but that was the theory that reigned in aristocratic Britain. As Austen's writing, this is something that's increasingly unraveling. And the new way in which you think about evaluating human beings, the new way is the way of those merchants and those traders. It's what we now call class. Class designations begin to take over in 18th century England. Class is a different way of evaluating people. All it depends on is how much money you have. How much money do you have? That tells you where you are. Are you middle class? Lower class, lower upper class, upper middle class? All of these designations are very fine ways of deciding how much money you have and therefore how you relate to other people. There's something else that's significant about that designation though. It can change, right? You can start lower class and end up upper class. You can start upper class and end up lower class. All it depends on is the raw amount of wealth that you have. And with these changes going on from one that's very rigid, a very rigid designation. It's about social status. You're either common or you're noble and you don't get to pick. To class, where you can change your position. That's an important backdrop, economic backdrop, for all of Austen's novels. That's one of the historical changes that's going on as Austen's writing. There's others as well that I want to talk a little bit about before I get to her novels. For almost all of Austen's life, the nation that she lived in, Great Britain, was at war. Almost the entire time that she was alive. Britain's monarch, George III, was an aggressively outward-looking king. And during his reign, captured many of the territories that would make up the British Empire. That British Empire that the sun never sets on, a lot of that gets created during his reign. He is the longest reigning monarch, officially, in British history. Ascended in 1760. He officially reigned until 1820. It's a significant amount of British history that's taken up with this specific man. You might have heard that before, and I'm sure you have. George III drew the ire of a lot of Americans. He's the monarch who reigned during the Revolutionary War. And that's one of the ways in which Americans know him best. Now, this expansionism and warfare was incredibly significant for British life. During the late 18th and early 19th century, Britain consolidated its holdings in North America and then lost them, captured Canada, gained islands in the West Indies, and and maybe most importantly, began its dominion over India, which would become the most important colony with the loss of North America. It engaged in war over these colonies, almost always with the French. And from 1802 to 1815, fought a series of wars with France, in particular with Napoleonic France, that basically went on perpetually. So for most of Austen's adult life, Britain was at war, either trying to gain or protect its colonial holdings from other nations trying to create their own empire. So it's an incredibly volatile period that she's living through. Yet nonetheless, Austen's novels don't really seem to deal with any of this subject matter. She doesn't deal with, say, urban centers like London in a way that Charles Dickens would about 20 or 30 years later. She doesn't deal with the broad scope of provincial life like George Eliot would 20 or 30 years later. She doesn't talk at all about any of the colonial wars that are going on. It's not exactly true, and I'll talk more about that in a second. And I think here, Mrs. Bennet's idea that they socialize with 4 and 20 families, I think that's the apposite idea here for us. Socializing with a small segment of what we would now call good people in this fictional town of Meryton, that's the backdrop, the very narrow, maybe, and exclusive backdrop for a lot of Austen's novels. Little of Britain's historical ambitions ever appear. The narrowed focus of her novel can sometimes seem to be willfully ignorant of history. And I think this is a question you're going to want to take to Persuasion, which might be the most historical of her novels. A number of the characters in there are in the British Navy. Wentworth served in India and makes a vast fortune there. That was a very common story in the late 18th century, and a fraught one. A lot of people go to India, make a phenomenal amount of money, and come back to England and are their version of what we now would think of as nouveau riche. Creates a lot of anxieties, and Wentworth is in some ways an example of that. So Persuasion might be her most historical novel in a large number of works that seem to be willfully ahistorical. Or maybe it's a different kind of history. Austen might actually be much more interested in the everyday life of the British countryside. So with that in mind, I wanted to just give some examples that might flavor for you what exactly it was like to be alive in 1800, for someone like Jane Austen to be alive in 1800. In 1800, there were no anesthetics for surgery. A number of dentists suggested that you brush your teeth with gunpowder to maintain the whiteness of your teeth. There's more. Infant mortality was incredibly high. It was not uncommon for families to have 6 or 7 children and for one or none of them to survive out of infancy. The Austen family is incredibly lucky that all 8 of their children live into adulthood. Very unusual in my experience, extremely rare thing. There was no modern system of electricity. There was no gas lighting. So poor people, laborers in particular, lived by the sun. The sun was the thing that provided light. You could produce artificial light with candles and increasingly with lanterns that often used whale oil. But this was a very expensive option. So it wasn't available to a lot of people. In 1700, there was no modern system of plumbing, even in cities like London, although increasingly as the century went on, that was the case. But in many places of England, even in 1800, it's outhouses and wells. That's the rule. The judicial system was incredibly harsh, with sentences of death by hanging, even for fairly petty offenses, as we would think of them right now. Particularly early in the 18th century, hangings were spectacles. They were something that you went to. They were almost like entertainment. And the most famous place, Tyburn Fields, where there was a gallows in what was then a field outside of London in the early 18th century, which is now in central London, was an incredibly evocative scene. Observers coming out, people selling refreshments, even the condemned giving sort of raucous speeches, final speeches, before they were hung. Very complex social spectacles that were going on, and very different than the way we think of execution now.